Conference, your source for JVM knowledge.
Yeah. Great, let's start. Okay, welcome to my talk. Thanks for coming. So today my talk is entitled, It's a Bird, It's a Plane, It's SDKMAN. Right, so quick word about myself. My name's Marco. I'm a polyglot JVM enthusiast. I like toying around with lots of languages. I'm currently using quite a lot of Kotlin and Java, and I still do Scala and Groovy as well. And I'm currently doing a bit of work with Go. I'll tell you a bit more about that later. I'm consulting in London and in Barcelona at the moment. I'm working with a company called Codurance, and our client at the moment is Mango, so that's why I go to Barcelona quite often. And in my spare time, I'm the creator and maintainer of SDKMAN. And you can catch me on Twitter at that handle. So that's Codurance, that's our company. So these guys are really, really serious about the good things about code. They're into software craftsmanship. They stand for XP practices and clean code. It's all the stuff that we really aspire to as developers, I think. So great company. They're opening an office in Madrid very soon. So if you're interested, come and have a chat to me afterwards. Right, so the talk is going to be dealing with, firstly, we're going to talk about the problems that SDKMAN is trying to solve. So we'll look at the problem space, and we'll look at how SDKMAN answers that space. We'll dive into exactly what an SDK is, as opposed to a package. Then we'll look at the architecture of SDKMAN. We'll look at the underlying infrastructure, how and where it's deployed. We'll look at the vendoring aspects of SDKMAN, contribution, and if we have time, we'll look at what the future holds. And if you want to look at the slides afterwards, you can just make a note of that bit.ly link over there. By the way, the slides are written in ASCII doc, so enjoy. Right, so I'm going to mix things up a little bit. I'm going to start up with a little demo. I think it's a bit refreshing because we always have demos at the end, so let's do it first. Right, so what I'm going to do is I'm spinning up a tiny little Docker container on my machine, which already has SDKMAN pre-installed. Right, so if I type SDK there, you can see SDKMAN is already there. I've also cheated a little bit. If I step into the root folder, which is the main user in this Docker container, you'll see the SDKMAN folder there, and inside of it, I've already preloaded it with a few archives. That's just so that we don't have to go downloading a bunch of archives when I install things. This is a nice little trick that people don't actually know about. We actually cache every single SDK that we download in that folder. So what you could do, if you're using this on a CI environment, is you can actually cache that folder, and then you don't need to download the zips every single time when your build runs. So that's just a little handy little trick. So first off, SDKMAN, as you know, is a very simple tool, and we've designed it that way for a very good reason. We want it to be easy, ergonomic, for everybody to use. It should not be a pain to use SDKMAN. So that's why there are relatively few commands, and the commands are structured in a very specific way. Yet, people still sometimes get a little bit confused about the commands. So I just want to distill some of those things, just kind of iron those things out, to show you how those commands should be used and the effect that they have. So let's play with Kotlin today, right? So let's say SDK ls Kotlin. So there you see all the available versions of Kotlin. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm simply going to say SDK install Kotlin, and I'm going to install 1.2.71. So that's the latest in the 1.2 series. So there we go. It actually finds it in the archives folder, doesn't download it, and it installs it. So if we now list, there you go. So it's now, as you can see, it's number one, it's installed, and number two, it's in use. Now, what a lot of people do is when they're installing an SDK, they use the use command. They say SDK use Kotlin 1.3.21. Now, the use command should not actually be used in that way. It's not for installing. The use command is actually used for something else, which I'll show you in a minute. What you should be doing at this point is you should either say SDK install Kotlin, which will, without a version, which will then go and get the latest, greatest for you. Or even better, what you can do is you can say SDK upgrade Kotlin, or any other candidate. If you leave off Kotlin, it'll actually go through all your candidates and upgrade every single one of them. So this is a really nice way to just get the latest one. So there it tells me, okay, 1.2.7.1 is smaller than 1.3.21, and can it install it? So there we go. And now that's installed. So if I say SDK ls Kotlin, there we go. And that's now the new default version. Right, so back to the use command. So if I open a new container, or a connection to the same container, so if I say docker, docker exec. There we go. Now I've just connected to that same, an interactive terminal to that same container, and I say SDK ls Kotlin. There we go. So now 1.3.21 is the default. Now here's how I use the SDK use command. So I say SDK use Kotlin, and I use 1.2.7.1, which is the one that I previously installed. So now if I type Kotlin version, you can see it's 1.2.7.1 in this shell. If I open a new shell, it'll fall back to 1.3.21 again, because that's the default version. So that's what use is for. It's so that you can have one shell running a different version of your candidate. So that's really handy if you're testing for backward compatibility or something. Say you're writing a Grails plugin, or something to do with Gradle, or even with Java. If you want to try out different versions of Java side by side, you can do it this way. So now I say in this one, I say Kotlin version, and there you can see that one is still running 1.3.21. So that's a handy trick, and that's what the use command should be used for generally. So just something to keep in mind. If you want to make another version your default again, then you can simply say SDK default. There's a default command that will set the default for every new shell back to 1.2.71. There we go. So now from here on out, every single shell that you open will be 1.2.71 again. Cool. So that's it. Right. So SDKs. What are SDKs? So before I start this, just keep this in mind. An SDK versus a package. People often call SDKMAN a package manager. Now, I'll explain a few things to you, and then you can tell me whether it's a package manager or an SDK manager. Right, so firstly, what is an SDK? So typically, they are packages, just get rid of that. They are packages that normally come in a zip or a tarball, so a tar.gzip file. They have one single containing folder that's usually the name and the version, separated by a dash. Not always, but usually. They have an internal little Unix folder structure under that containing folder. So you'll typically see a bin, a lib, an etc, a conf, maybe a libexec. It usually has a bunch of folders under that one folder. And inside of those, you will find different artifacts. Also, and this is the most important part, an SDK is usually completely self-contained. It stands on its own. It doesn't have dependencies, except in the JVM world, you normally have a dependency on Java. So you might have to have Java installed, or you'll definitely have to have Java installed on your machine in order to use JVM SDKs. So if you unzip, so here we've got the Spring Boot one because it's really lightweight. It's got very little inside. So I use that as an example. You'll see when you unzip it, it creates that containing folder, like I said, and there are all the little smaller folders underneath. And if I run a tree, that's kind of the structure you see. Right, so that's a model SDK. That's what they should look like. So what is a package, on the other hand? So they normally come in different flavors, right? So every Linux distribution or every platform will have its own variants. So a deb and an RPM is normally what you will see on Linux, depending on whether it's a Debian or a Red Hat-based distro. DMGs and PKGs are what you'll see on OS X, and on Windows you'll see MSIs and EXEs. And they're all vastly different. They all have internally, they have a complex folder structure. Very often, like in the case of the deb, you'll have archives inside of archives. There'll be descriptors and scripts which actually extract the contents of the package and deposit it at different places on your file system. And of course, like I said, it's custom for every distribution and platform. And this is the big thing. Packages have external dependencies, and your package manager will handle resolving all the dependencies, pulling back the entire graph of dependencies, and installing those all for you on your behalf. So with that in mind, can you see that it's actually not a package manager? It is really an SDK manager, which means it can be used in conjunction with package managers. You can still use your package manager as you normally do, but when you want to install SDKs, try and prefer using an SDK manager, because that's what it's best at. Right. So, itches and scratches. So every itch has a scratch. And that's effectively how SDKMAN was born. So I had an itch. When I started working with Java many years back, on my very first day at work, my first task was I had to go and download from Sun Microsystems' website the JDK, and it was JDK 1.3, I think it was. So I had to go through all their web pages, find the right link, download the binary. After downloading the thing, I had to go and extract it to some random place. Then I had to go and update a Java home environment variable. Then I had to go and add that environment variable to my path. Then later on, when I started working with Grails, I wanted to use multiple versions of Grails to test my plugins. So I had to conjure up this whole complex way with using symlinks to try and switch between multiple versions. It was a pain. It's a boring task, right? And it's a pain in the jack. So it's something you don't want to be doing. So after 10 years of this, of just going through this continual pain, I thought, really, I've got to do something about it. So I decided to write an SDK manager. And it turns out that other people were also feeling that pain, which is great. So there was people who were actually interested in this. People wanted to use this thing. Initially, it was just for the Groovy ecosystem, but then later we started including all sorts of other SDKs. So we wanted it to be able to install multiple candidates, multiple versions per candidate. We wanted to handle the downloads for you seamlessly, extraction of archives, you shouldn't even have to worry about that, setting of all the environment variables taken care of, and very important, it always needs to be up to date so that you always have the very latest available to you at any time. And also very important, it needed to run on any platform. Where package managers were very focused on their platform, this needed to run on OS X, on Linux, on Windows with Cygwin. basically anywhere where you could get a Unix environment up and running. So, don't know what's going on there. Aliens. Right, so let's take a look at the architecture of SDKMAN. Let's see how it actually functions under the hood. So first off, let's focus at the front end part of it, which is the command line interface. So, big question. People always ask me, why did we write this thing in Bash? You know, why on earth would you do that? And then they always say, why didn't you write it in Groovy? Or why didn't you write it in Python? Or name your favorite language. So the reason we did this was because usually on a system, Bash is your lowest common denominator. It's always present. Even like you just saw that little Docker container I spun up. That's like a little base Docker container, and it has Bash, and I can install my entire toolchain right there. I don't need anything else. So lightweight, it runs super fast. I don't have to wait for a JVM to start up, right? Which is a bonus. It's available on just about any platform under the sun, including Solaris and FreeBSD. You know, it works there. It's tested. No dependencies, except for one or two small things. We use curl for connection to the internet, and we use zip for extracting archives. These days, we also depend on unzip, tar, and gzip if you're working with JDKs. So when we install SDKMAN on your machine, it adds a tiny little snippet, as you can see over there, to the end of your Bash profile. Or if you're using ZSH, it'll be on the end of your ZSH RC file. So what this basically does is it just simply sources a file that lies under your home in the .sdkman bin folder called sdkman init.sh. So that kicks off the bootstrapping of SDKMAN. Now that file contains a little snippet, which in turn goes and sources a whole bunch of shell scripts that lie under the source folder in that .sdkman folder. So it'll run through every single one of them, and it'll source them. Now, why are we sourcing them? So there's a good reason for that. SDKMAN is built purely with Bash functions, right? There's no shell scripts. Everything is a function. So inside those files, if you look at, for instance, the SDKMAN help.sh, you'll actually see there's a top-level function, and there might be some additional helper functions underneath. And they all have a rather peculiar name. They all start with underscore, underscore, SDK, underscore, and then the name of the command, right? So one of those scripts contains a top-level function called SDK. And that's the one that you actually invoke when you use the command line, SDK list Kotlin, like we saw just now. This is actually the function that gets executed. I've simplified it a little bit, but in essence, this is it. And what you'll see is it brings in some parameters. So list would be a parameter. Kotlin would be a qualifier. And what we do at the end, we actually build the name of the function that you saw in the previous slide over there. We actually build that over there, passing in the qualifier and any other parameters. So we're actually calling a function which calls another function, and which in turn will call other helper functions under the hood to do its work. So everything is, it's not functional, but it's divided up into functions, and your top-level entry point is actually a Bash function. But here be dragons. There's a problem with Bash. So even though Bash works really well in 95% of the cases, there are those cases where people have issues. And this is down to the fact that Bash is not very stable. It's not a very stable runtime, if you want to call it that. So when you buy a Mac, out of the box, that Mac will come with a 12-year-old version of Bash. It's version 3.x. And Apple refuses to upgrade it to 5, like we're 2 major versions ahead, because of some licensing issue. So they'd rather let a shell go out that maybe has security vulnerabilities rather than just dealing with this licensing issue. So unfortunately, it does come with an ancient shell. Now, obviously, the first thing you should do if you have a Mac is install brew and upgrade bash to bash 5. I mean, then all your problems will go away. But until that gets resolved, yes, you'll have inconsistencies, and you'll get warnings from SDKMAN as well at times when you try and do certain operations. It'll tell you you're on an older version. So try and upgrade to bash 5, right? So this discrepancy, because I mean, whatever Linux distro you're on, some of them, like old Debian distros, will have older versions of bash 2. So it's not stable. So started thinking about a different approach. We started thinking about rewriting the CLI in some kind of native implementation. So when I say native, I'm talking about something like Go, or Rust, for instance, or even like Kotlin native or Scala native. So that will guarantee that we have consistent behavior across all platforms. We're no longer dependent on this bash issue that we currently have. It runs on top of LLVM. It'll be completely multi-platform, so we'll cross-compile for all different platforms, and depending on what platform you're on, you'll get your own flavor of binary without even knowing it. It'll have no dependencies, so the dependencies on curl, for instance, go away. And it also has, most of them have very powerful standard libraries. If you look at Go, for instance, and I think the same goes for Rust, you have all sorts of great libraries in there that become bundled into your binary that you build and send out. So there'll be HTTP clients built in, there'll be the ability to marshal JSON, etc., etc. So great stuff there. Right, of course, SDKMAN is not just a CLI. It actually has a substantial back end. Let's take a little look at that next. So we have microservices in the back end. These are all deployed in their own Docker container, fronted by Nginx, and backed by data stores. We've got MongoDB for the main candidates database, and Postgres for user credentials. Let's take a look at the main API first. So apart from the proxy service, the first service is the candidate service. So this is the one that actually gets used when we deal with anything with a subdomain of a candidate. In other words, say we were looking at Kotlin and versions just now, all that information comes from the candidate API. So let's have a closer peek at that. Whoops, just messed that up. So, right, so this is the SDKMAN service. It's a Play framework service written in Scala. So this is the roots file that Play provides. And here you'll see all kinds of verbs that are familiar to you in the CLI. So for instance, we have a list over there. So that will, for instance, list the little template that you see rendered that has all the versions of the candidate, nicely ordered, for instance. And then there's the default, there's the validate. This one will bring back all the versions for a given candidate, and so forth. Or there's one that lists all the candidates. So everything to do with candidates lives in this service. The next service, and this is an interesting one, is the hooks service. Also written in Scala, also Play framework. This service came about when we introduced Java. So Java is a bit naughty. So Oracle don't bundle all their SDKs in a standard format. Some of them actually come as DMGs or exe files. So we have to do some work to get them into the shape that they need to be. And these changes also vary between major versions of Java. So you'll have different versions responding in different ways. So I decided to roll out this hook service. So what this does is it actually renders back a snippet of bash to you that's dynamic. And that bash, once you receive it back, gets executed against a specific artifact and knows exactly how to extract it. Which means if Oracle goes and makes changes to the internal structure once again, we can respond very fast by just deploying a new version of the service rather than having to roll this out to everyone's machines. So in this case over here, I've highlighted, this is the piece of code that gets executed if you come in asking for OS X, Java 8, Oracle. It renders a template, and the template looks like this. So that's a function entry point over there, and the bash script actually starts there. So that's a template that will just get rendered. And Play already knows that if it's a .scala.text, it'll automatically set your content type correct and render that back to you as a script. So it's very handy. So this service will probably be removed in the very foreseeable future because the only Oracle JDK that we still host is JDK 8. All the others have been put behind some kind of login page, so you can't get to them anymore. But this one is still out in the open. But it's no longer supported. So I think pretty soon we'll pull this, and eventually the service, the functionality of the service will be baked back into the CLI once it all settles down. Cool. So right, in terms of infrastructure, we deploy everything. Before it was deployed on Heroku, it's now deployed on DigitalOcean. When we build our services, we bundle them in Docker images, and they all get pushed to Docker Hub. And when we deploy, we use Terraform and Ansible to just pull those images down and run them on the nodes. In the future, we might look at going to Kubernetes, but at the moment, we don't have that kind of scale yet. So this absolutely works perfectly at the moment. So, right, let's quickly talk about vendoring. So what is vendoring? So this whole effort came about when I was sitting somewhere on a beach with my wife, and I got a notification that there was a new version of Groovy, I think it was, and I had to run back to the hotel and go and do a release, and my wife was very upset with me. And that's when I realized that I'd become my own bottleneck. I couldn't maintain it, and the candidates were just becoming more and more, and it was just getting quite wild, just like frantically, oh, there's a new version of so-and-so, you know, and then... So I decided, let's introduce an API where vendors can push and publish their own versions. So we rolled that out some time ago, and it's been going really smoothly. There's no major hiccups, and it's just empowered all the vendors to do their own stuff, and it's freed me up a lot. So all the big ones are on there now. So Micronaut joined us recently, so that was really exciting to have them on board. And we've got Groovy, we've got Kotlin, Gradle, you name it. They're all there. They're all pushing their own stuff. They also have an endpoint that they can call that does an announcement, which is really cool because that pushes to Twitter automatically. So it automatically tweets the moment a new version lands. So if you follow the SDKMAN Twitter, you'll get updates about every new SDK that's just been pushed out. So, and then for convenience, we wrap that in a Gradle plugin and a Maven plugin. So that does the API calls on your behalf, and you don't have to worry about anything. Of course, there's another case, though. A lot of SDKs are unmanaged. So I'm thinking in particular of something like Java. All right? So Java has many different vendors. There's Azul, there's Java.net, There's a whole bunch of them, right? There's the new Amazon Corito, that's come out. All of those are on there, and nobody actually owns Java. So what we did last year was we introduced a database migration project. So let me quickly show you what that looks like. So the idea behind this is to empower the community. So what we want is we want the community to start getting involved. If you go onto SDKMAN and you see something that is missing a version that you really need, you can simply go to this project, raise a PR. It uses MongoDB under the hood, and it'll just quickly run a migration against our database, add the new version, maybe set it to default if necessary. You can remove versions. So you can find this project under SDKMAN. It's called SDKMAN DB Migrations. And it's got a very extensive README that shows you exactly how the model in the database works, where everything lives, and then it gives you a bunch of examples of how you can do this. So I wrote a nice DSL in Scala that allows you to write very simple little migrations. They're very concise, very easy. They internally do a validation. You'll call it a validate method, which will actually go and probe that URL to see if that URL actually exists before inserting it into the database. So it does some sanity checks. And I basically review those pull requests. I hit the button, and minutes later, after the build is run, this thing gets entered into the database. So it's a great way to enable you as a community to get involved and to actually start doing your own releases. Right, which brings us to the next point. We like contributions. There are many, many places where everybody can get involved in contributing to SDKMAN. So I already mentioned the database migrations. That's a really easy entry point for you to get involved and start really making a big impact. I mean, I get lots of these little PRs, They're so easy to do, and it's just such a nice way. Everybody benefits out of it. But in addition to that, we also have a lot of things that still need to be developed. So we've got a Trello board. As you can see there, we've got lots of bugs on the side there. Little things, nothing major, but they're all little things, Sometimes platform specific. There's a whole section on tech debt. There's some features there. It's all nicely laid out, and most of them have corresponding tickets on GitHub. So if you go and look at the issues in GitHub, they'll be there. So what we normally do is we've got a Gitter channel. You can get to that Gitter channel from our homepage, sdkman.io. And there you can ask questions. You can ask about new features or potential bugs. And if we see that it is really a bug, or if it's a valid feature that actually makes sense in the bigger picture, then we encourage you to raise an issue on GitHub, and then it goes onto our board. So, and we have quite stringent contributor guidelines now, because people were just opening random GitHub issues all the time. So this has kind of slowed it down a little bit and made it a bit more manageable. So we have this process in place now, which helps. So what does the future hold? Right, so I think top of the list at the moment for me is the native rewrite. We still have to decide on the technology. I think, well, I've done a major spike in Go that is pretty functional. It's got one or two features working nicely. So that is definitely a top candidate. But I've been speaking to you. He's been talking to me about Rust in my ear. So I'll definitely take a look at Rust as well. Rust is functional, which is really nice. It's my preferred way of programming, I think, so that'll definitely be something to explore. But the big thing is there will still always be a bash or a ZSH or a PowerShell wrapper around SDKMAN, around the native implementation, because something still needs to export environment variables. So it'll come in exactly the same way that it does now. It'll actually be bundled as part of the thing that gets installed on your machine when you curl it down. You won't even be aware of the fact that slowly we're cutting it over to a native implementation. We're going to probably start with something really simple first, just getting something end-to-end working like the SDK version command. And then slowly, one by one, we're going to start eating away iteratively, slowly doing minor releases until the whole core of it has been cut over to native. So that's my plan of going ahead. I don't want to do a big bang rewrite because I think that'll just break a lot of things and make people unhappy. So rather do it in a very iterative way. We've got a very extensive suite of Cucumber features that run against the CLI. So we'll keep running that the whole time as part of the build to make sure that it's still compliant and that it's all working. So I think another exciting thing is going native means we can actually start working with more complex data structures than CSV. At the moment, the API serves back CSV as its data format because Bash pretty much sucks with complex data structures. So that's going to give us the ability to just marshal it into JSON or marshal from JSON into objects and just use them internally. So that's also going to mean a new little API that we're going to build, and I'm thinking of doing that in Micronaut, maybe with Kotlin. So that's going to be a nice little project going ahead. Another big thing that's going to change is SDKMAN is going to become offline by default. So think about apt, right? If you're using apt-get, or if you're using Red Hat Package Manager, RPM, or if you're using, think about Git, for instance. They all maintain their state locally. So you always have to do an apt-get update first to pull everything down, and then you can start working. Or you can do a git fetch to bring the remote representation down to your local machine. So at the moment, SDKMAN is a bit chatty. It is going to the internet quite a lot. So I think that is definitely something that we're going to be looking at doing, just to try and break that hard dependency on the internet, so that you can sit on a plane and comfortably work and switch between SDKs. So, right, another thing, obviously, I think last year, the year before, we introduced Java, and that was a big thing for us. That changed things a lot. I already showed you the hooks service. That had huge impact on how SDKMAN works. So I think subsequent to that, because Java is quite different from all the other candidates, I'm thinking of doing something like a custom list view just for Java, where we can show the vendor and we can show a little bit more information about that specific version. We can maybe have sections that group different major versions of Java together, just to make it a little bit easier to understand. Also, we would like to have a bit more like auto-completion in there as well. So if you do a list view, you don't have to go and copy and paste, because I know that's a pain for everyone. Go and copy and paste the version and then put it in. So these are the kind of things that we're looking at. Right, and then there's a whole bunch of new features that people have been asking for. So this is where I'm looking at you, all of you, to get involved, you know. There's simple things like getting an official Docker image published, that should be like child's play. Major version aliases, especially for the JDK. You want to be able to track the latest JDK 8 or JDK 11 or whatever. So that sort of thing, that is going to have huge impact on how SDKMAN works, because that will obviously affect all the candidates. System installation fallback. If you don't have Java installed, that it automatically falls back to what's already on your system. A lot of systems already have Java there. Per project SDK configuration, I still get asked that quite a lot. I don't really like the idea of something hijacking your shell and changing things in your shell, but people want it. So we should give them the option if they really want it. Offer available versions when version is emitted. That's what I just spoke about as well, where it maybe gives you a list of versions if you don't specify the version. And there's a cleanup command feature. People have been asking about this as well, where when you install a new version, that it'll automatically clear out the old version that is obsolete. So that's it. Thank you very much for coming to my talk. So hopefully we have 5 minutes left for Q&A.
So did you say that SDKMAN now works by default connected to the internet? So if you are on a plane, you can use it. But if you try to do something when you don't have internet connection, it shows a message. Now it's working on offline mode, but you still can switch versions. So yeah. Can you explain that a little bit? Because now I think it works.
It works, but the offline mode is kind of broken. You'll see in some situations it doesn't work properly. And sometimes when your internet is slow, then it'll show you this horrible message. And it's not a smooth switch. It's very difficult to do in Bash, right? To check whether the internet is up or not. So as a result, I get inundated with people asking me, what's wrong? I can't connect, because maybe they're very remote and now their connection is timing out, for instance. So I'd rather do that sort of thing, that bulk download of all the candidates and the versions. I would rather do that up front and only go to the internet when I really have to. Like, for instance, if you want to install a new binary, sure, you can't do without the internet there. So then I'd rather go out to the internet and get it. But I don't want to be doing little calls to the internet the whole time and risk the experience being bad. Okay. Yeah.
More questions?
Hello, congratulations for the presentation. I got a question. How much or which one are the SDKs that you can manage with this? I mean, Kotlin, Java, Node?
So, the list just goes on, right? You can add as many as you want. I don't know if you're aware of the SDK list. These are all the SDKs that are available, and you can see all the major ones are there, from Ant all the way through to Gradle, and just about any JVM language is on there. We've got Salon, we've got Kotlin, we've got Groovy, Java, you name it, they're all there, right? So, and that list can just keep growing, but I'd like to confine it to JVM SDKs. I think that is our focus, because other SDKs outside of the JVM are often packaged very differently as well. They're not as disciplined about the way that they package their SDKs as what the JVM community is. So,
thank you.
Cool.
More questions?
Regarding the vendoring, is Maven using the vendoring API now also, or weren't you able to figure out the release process for Maven?
So I engaged with the Maven community, and they were just really unfriendly and not willing to call our API. So eventually, just after, I really got flamed really badly. I don't know if any of you followed that. It happened about a year ago.
Yeah, I saw the thread. That's why I'm asking if it's sorted out or not.
And I was just trying to be nice, I was just saying, call our API, let's help the people. And they were just like, who are you, So eventually we just left it. And now people who really do want to use Maven can use Maven through the database migrations. If they want a specific version, they can now just raise a PR and get it there themselves. So there is a workaround. And Maven is available, so yeah.
Thanks.
Cool.
More questions?
Just one last thing before I forget. Also, I've got some stickers here for those interested. I don't have. Oh, do we? Okay.
Would you recommend, so I was just thinking, currently I don't have that many SDKs I need on the CI, but I was just thinking to put an official Docker container I would be happy to create and then use that as an ultimate build container on my Jenkins. Would you recommend that, or is there anything I'm missing?
So I mentioned that just now. There is actually an issue open for an official Docker image of SDKMAN that will give you a pre-installed version, and it should be part of the main SDKMAN CLI build. So it should produce a Docker container and automatically publish that to Docker Hub. And then people can use that on their CI if they want, and just install anything inside that container that they need in their builds. So I think that's that's in the card. So if you want to help with that, that would be great.
I have a question actually.
Yeah.
You have referred often as we.
Yeah.
Is you, or are there many more people? When you say we.
I do get people helping me sometimes, yeah.
Okay.
But it's mostly me.
Okay. Yeah, I wanted to thank you, Marco, for SDKMAN. It's an awesome tool. I use it every day. It saves a lot of time to me, and I am probably 100% sure for most of the attendees in the conference. So thank you very much.
Thank you, and thanks for coming. Thanks.